Hi, friends. Today we are going to become scientists and we are going to play with lots of fun, cool things, especially today. Today we're going to work with candy. But before we can do any experiments, we have to figure out what it is a scientist actually does. Who is a scientist? Do you know what a scientist does? A scientist asks questions about everything in the world. Scientists ask questions about bugs, about the sun, about dinosaurs, about rocks, about air, weather, the land, about fire, or cooking even. Some scientists deal with food and things. There's lots of different types of scientists, but all of them ask questions. That is what they do. They ask questions and find out answers. And they go about that in a really, really specific way. They follow a plan. And we are going to do that today. We are going to follow a plan to find out some information. Today is all about sink and float. We are going to see what things sink and float. Now, we're not going to use toys or apples and oranges or blocks. Today, we are going to use candy. And the question we are going to have to ask ourselves is, does candy float? Will the candy float in this water? That means it's not going to sink to the bottom. Well, we have lots of different types of candy, so we have to think about, we have to ask our question, does candy float? That is our question that we are going to ask, and we're wondering about that. We're going, does candy float? But then we have to think about it. And we have to be specific. We have to say which candy is going to float and which candy might sink to the bottom. So I have a bunch of different candies, and we are going to think about it and think, I think that this candy is going to float. And when we ask that type of question and give that type of answer or statement, we're creating what's called a hypothesis. Can you say hypothesis? That's a really big word, hypothesis. But we are going to test a hypothesis. First, we have to decide which candies would sink or float. So we're going to think about it. Now, I have different candies, and we're going to decide which ones we think are going to sink or float. Twix. I think Twix is going to float. So I'm going to put a check mark here because I think it's going to float. And then we have Snickers. Snickers has nuts in it, and it kind of is a heavy candy bar. So I think a Snickers is going to sink. Now, Kit Kat. Kit Kat is not heavy at all. So I think Kit Kat's going to float. Then we have Reese's. Ooh, that has peanut butter in it. I wonder, sink or float? I'm going to go with sink. And then we have just a regular old Hershey bar. I think that one's going to float. So I think Twix, Kit Kat, and Hershey's are going to float, and the Snickers and the Reese's are going to sink. So now it's time for me to test what I think. So I wondered, does candy float or sink? Then I thought about it and I said, I think Twix, Kit Kat, and Hershey's are going to float, and Snickers and Reese's are going to sink. Now it's time to do the experiment. Now it's time to test. Are you ready? So Twix, let's get our Twix here. What do we think? Oh, well, let's see here. It's not on the bottom. Ooh, it's rising to the top, actually. So we found out, we tested our hypothesis, and Twix floated. So we were right on that one. Okay, are we ready? Let's see about a Snickers bar. Feels heavier than the Twix did. Oh. The Twix sunk straight to the bottom. I mean, the Snickers sunk straight to the bottom. So we were right. It sank. Okay, here we go with the Kit Kat. Kit Kat stays right on the top right there. It completely floated. We were right on that one. Okay, let's see here. Let's test a Reese's. I'm going to take it out of the paper. Kind of melty because it's hot outside. It sunk right to the bottom. So we were right about that one too. We have one last one left. Are we ready? Let's try the Hershey's. Oh, the Hershey's sank. I thought the Hershey's was going to float. So I was not correct on that. The Hershey's sank. But that's part of being a scientist too. We aren't always right. If I knew the answer, then there would be no question. I wouldn't need to experiment. But I didn't know the answer, so I was finding out. And then I put my information on this board to help me look at it and see what I was doing. So with all of that different candy, I found out that some of the candy floated, the Twix and the Kit Kat floated, but the Snickers, the Reese's, and the Hershey bars sank. Now, I wonder why some candy floats and some candy sinks. Well, let's look at the inside of a Twix. The inside of the Twix, it does have the caramel on top, but it has this cookie. And the cookie has holes in it. When something has holes in it, what can get inside? Air. So air gets inside of the Twix, which causes it to rise to the top because air doesn't weigh as much as water does. Now let's look at the Kit Kat. You can see all the tiny little holes inside the cookie also. So the candy that had cookies inside of it floated, but the candy that didn't have cookie inside of it sank. Because the Reese's is just full of peanut butter, and the Snickers is full of, it's not a cookie, it's called a nougat, so it's soft and squishy, but it doesn't have space for air holes. So things that float aren't as dense or heavy as the water, but the things that sink are heavier than the water. So the Hershey bar, which is still in the bottom of the bowl, was heavy, and the Snickers and the Reese's. But the two kinds of candies that had cookies in it floated because they weren't as dense. They were lighter than the water because the air got into those holes. So this was our first experiment as scientists today. There's going to be lots of more experiments and ways for us to be scientists on a bunch of other videos. Would you like to join me another day? Great. See you back here at science class.